and that the United States is in a colossal mess. Put it more generally, the West is in a colossal mess. Let's just start with what's happened with regard to Russia and China. As a result of the Ukraine war, the United States has helped push Russia into the arms of the Chinese. This is not in our strategic interest. We should have good relations with Russia because China is a peer competitor. Russia is not. China is a greater threat to the United States than Russia is. Pushing Russia, the third great power in the system, into the arms of your principal adversary, China, makes no sense at all. Furthermore, getting bogged down in Ukraine and now getting bogged down in the Middle East as well makes it very difficult to fully pivot to Asia to contain China, which is, again, America's principal mission at this point in time. So the Ukraine war has had really negative effects on America's ability to deal with China. Then, as you point out, there's Iran and there's North Korea. What we've hoped for in the past is that both China and Russia would cooperate with us to make sure that Iran did not go nuclear. Well, what happens if Iran decides it's going to develop nuclear weapons? Are the Russians and the Chinese going to work with us? I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. We've also hoped that the Chinese and the Russians would work with us to convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. That's not going to happen now either. So if you think about the nuclear proliferation issue as it applies to both North Korea and Iran, we have created a situation where we're in a very weak position with regard to those countries. So the situation here looks disastrous. And then when you marry to that situation what's going on in the Middle East, where the Israelis are doing poorly inside of Gaza, and there is no possibility that they're going to eliminate Hamas and create a peaceful Gaza, and where they're talking about attacking Hezbollah and escalating the war into Lebanon, you really begin to wonder. And then furthermore, on top of this, the Israelis are waging a genocidal campaign in Gaza that is going to cause the United States and especially Israel huge problems from a reputational and moral perspective moving forward.
Which is absolutely vital in diplomacy and getting, as you said at the top of this show, what diplomacy is to try to get the other side to do what you want to do, making them think it's in their interest to do so. If we don't have any moral authority, no one's going to do anything that we want them to do. It is crucial for the United States to get this war wrapped up quickly. So given where we are right now and given the momentum that we had been going down this path and apparently are heading it towards even into the spring here, how do we start to turn this ship around? And if you were invited into the administration and Biden just said, look, Professor, whatever you say, we're going to do, what would be our actions starting tomorrow?
Well, again, I think what you want to do is you want to solve the Ukraine problem by creating a neutral Ukraine and doing everything you can to make sure that the Russians feel assured that Ukraine and NATO are not together going to present them with a serious threat moving forward. And then at the same time, I think what you try to do is improve diplomatic relations slowly but steadily with the Russians. The problem is that selling that kind of diplomatic solution in the United States at this point in time is almost impossible. People are so deeply invested in this war and so thoroughly convinced that the Russians are a mortal threat to Western Europe or to Europe more generally and to the United States, that getting them to change their thinking is going to take a considerable amount of time. And what we don't have at this juncture is time.
The point I want to make is that this is what I'm about to show you is troubling, because what you just laid out is something that the administration should start doing, but right now. Now, maybe you're right. I certainly hope so, that behind the scenes, these conversations are going on right now. We need to get them escalated. But in order for those to have some success, we have to make sure that these kinds of public statements stop being made like this.
They're fighting for their democracy and fighting for our democracy. We need to send the resources to the Ukraine. And I want the people to know that Russia has been very evil, whether it's kidnapping children, raping women, killing families, and all the rest. But also, their army is bigger now than it was when it went into Ukraine. They are building, using money from people who are escaping sanctions and the rest, and getting help from Iran and from China and other places to build their technology. So we'll win in Ukraine. We must. We have to send the money. We must.
If that's your go forward position, that Russia's evil, then John, you're not going to have any negotiation. You're not going to talk to anybody because they're evil. You can't talk to evil. You can't make a deal with Hitler. All you can do is defeat him. And with that mentality, I don't know how the administration will then pivot to saying, okay, actually, he's evil and the devil, but let's make a deal with him. People are going to have a hard time with that. So I think you're going to have to change that before you can do the other.
Well, there's two things about Nancy Pelosi's comments. One is she does believe the Russians are evil and that you can't compromise with evil, as you point out. But she also believes that we have the resources to give Ukraine so that it can defeat the Russians. And the fact is, we don't have the resources. Leave aside the issue of whether Putin is evil. We don't have the resources. He is going to win in Ukraine. Ukraine is going to lose on the battlefield. And you have to then go from there to figure out how you can ameliorate the situation, how you can solve this problem. And that leaves you with diplomacy. And the good news is that the argument that Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler and he's the font of all evil in the modern world is a laughable argument, right? Nobody's arguing that Vladimir Putin is a nice guy, but the idea that he is someone who can't be dealt with in terms of diplomacy is not a serious argument. In fact, if you look at Putin's behavior from 2000, when he took over control in Russia, up until probably 2022, which is the year that Russia invaded Ukraine, he went out of his way to work with the West. There's no evidence that he was antagonistic toward the West and wanted to cause us trouble and wanted to conquer Ukraine. These are myths that the mainstream media and the foreign policy establishment created. Putin can be dealt with. He doesn't trust us much anymore, so we have a real problem here. There's a trust deficit for sure. But
right. And speaking of that trust deficit, actually, we had Doug McGregor on our show recently who talked on that very subject. If the Russians see the Western nations doing this, putting all this money in killing their troops, I mean, at some point, they're going to say, it's stupid for us not to get ready for that outcome. And of course, then you have this mutually building fear of each other. And that's what leads to a lot of wars. And so we're going down a path right now that our foolish actions here could lead us into catastrophe.
No, I think so. But I also think Mr. Putin is a rational man. He's never wanted any of this. He really wants to get back to some sort of state of normalcy with the West and do business. But as you say, he has to respond to what he sees develop. Right now, we have Americans moving in to create bases in northern Finland and Sweden. We've destroyed decades of trust and mutual confidence, replaced all of it with mutual suspicion, fear, and distrust.
So almost exactly what you just said there. So obviously there are some minds that are getting this here in the country. So the big question here in the last few minutes we have, how can we start to repair that, and what time frame are we talking about? And even to some extent, can it be repaired?
Well, it can't be repaired in the short term. That's the real problem here. The problem is that Putin, he's made this clear, right? He's explicitly said, I trusted the West much too much. I was wrong, and I don't trust them anymore. So you have this huge trust deficit. That's why I emphasize that if you're going to solve the problem diplomatically, you have to make a radical move right now. And that radical move is that NATO has to sever its relationship with Ukraine. Or to put it more generally, the West has to sever its relationship with Ukraine and accept the fact, trumpet the fact, that Ukraine is going to be a neutral state. That's the only hope for, I think, saving Ukraine at this point. But I don't see how you can do that because so many people think like Nancy Pelosi and don't think like Doug McGregor. Again, I want to emphasize that I think behind closed doors, people are beginning to move in the direction of Doug McGregor and away from Nancy Pelosi's way of thinking. I think they understand that the Ukrainians are doomed on the battlefield and that really there's no military solution here. We're going to have to turn to diplomacy. But again, the question is, how quickly can you go down that road? And my answer is you can't go down that road quickly. It takes too much time to turn the aircraft carrier around.
Well, I would argue there is one path, which comes with a near political suicide moment I mean, we just had Super Tuesday yesterday, so everybody's now really looking forward to November 2024, and every action politically is tied to what it may do to that. And of course, turning that ship in any capacity, even talking about it publicly, would be perceived as undercutting Biden's chance to win there. But John, that's what needs to be done. Biden should come out today, this afternoon, and say, all right, here's what we've been doing isn't working. And I mean like a 180-degree turn, which would be political suicide. They're probably right. But it's also the right thing to do and what we need in the commander-in-chief right now. You keep using the urgency of this, and I am wholeheartedly in agreement. It needs to happen now to save what's rest of Ukraine, to save more Ukrainian people, to save our own reputation and stop the damage, which will take a generation to repair. The longer we wait to do what you suggest here, the more damage we're going to suffer, and I don't even know where it may end up.
Let me make a quick point to you. There is one possible scenario that we haven't discussed that could radically transform things.
Oh, lay it on me.
It is possible that the Ukrainian army will crumble in the not too distant future. If you look at the beating that the Ukrainians are taking on the battlefield, and you look at the trouble in Kyiv in terms of both the military hierarchy having to do with the firing of General Zaluzhny,
and then all of the commanders after that have been purged down to brigade level.
Yes, and General Syrski, who is in charge now, is hardly a popular commander.
Right.
And if you look at all of the trouble surrounding President Zelensky at this point in time, he was once, sort of in the catbird seat. He's in political trouble now. So you look at what's happening inside of Kyiv, and you look at what's happening on the battlefield. You can imagine a situation. I'm not arguing that this is going to happen or that it's highly likely, but you can imagine a situation where the army crumbles on the battlefield and there is a coup in Kyiv. And the Ukrainians themselves decide, and even the West comes to the realization that it is time to negotiate. And the Russians understand that they are definitely playing from
position of strength.
Position of strength, yeah. And therefore, things rapidly move to where you get some sort of meaningful diplomacy. I mean, that's a possibility. I want to emphasize it's just a possibility. But I've spent a lot of time over the years studying armies and how they fight wars and how some armies collapse at the end and others don't collapse. I think there is a serious possibility, again, not a likelihood, but a serious possibility that the Ukrainian army could just shatter. It's just taken such a beating. And when you look at the politics that sit behind that army fighting in the battlefield, you can really begin to tell yourself a story about how things fall apart. And in a funny way, in a perverse way, if the Ukrainian army were to fall apart, that might create the incentives to move to the diplomatic track, which is both you and I agree would be the best possible solution for Ukraine. Again, it's sort of a perverse logic here. We're basically saying the sooner this thing gets done on the battlefield for the Ukrainians and the sooner they lose, the more likely it is that they'll move to getting some sort of diplomatic solution that will work to their advantage.
And what is so anguishing to me, John, is that could be done today. There could be a unilaterally declared ceasefire right now and then move on to a bilateral ceasefire and move into negotiations and just acknowledging the reality here that the killing could stop on both sides of the line. No more territory would have to be lost. I mean, it's not a guarantee. It would be hard to do, but it is absolutely in the realm of possibility. Or we can just let things continue to go on with the fiction until it collapses. But getting back to my point a second ago, you talk about political suicide. Do you think Biden would survive at all into the November election? Should he actually still be serving at that point? If all of his plans collapse and all of these claims we've made for 2 years just crumbles inside of everybody, that would be far worse. That I don't think you could recover from that one politically. But if you take the other course where you take the political courage right now, then there's at least a possibility because you can argue that this makes sense or whatever. The other one, you've lost all ability to have any arguments. So even politically, much less strategically, it makes sense to do exactly what you argued we should do. I hope they listen.
The problem is, though, just going back to President Macron, who we talked a lot about at the beginning of the program, what he reflects is just how deeply involved the West is in this war, how committed we are, and therefore how difficult it is for us to reverse direction and go down the diplomatic road in a serious way. I mean, Macron is saying certain things like putting boots on the ground in Ukraine that most Western leaders would certainly not say today or even in the future. But nevertheless, I think almost all Western leaders feel the way he does, the way Macron does, about just how important our commitment to Ukraine is, and how important it is for the future of NATO, and how if we walk away militarily from this conflict, it will damage the alliance. I mean, I think that's the way most people think.
It is, John, but the perverse logic underneath that desire is that if you think that would weaken NATO, that is nothing compared to what happens if what you said is likely, that Russia wins and Ukraine loses. That will undercut NATO, because then it'll show that all these efforts you put, all these weapons, all the money, all the strategy, all the technology, the training, everything utterly failed. And then you have a real credibility problem.
But the problem, Danny, with that point is that Russia wins regardless. Right. It's only a question of how big the win is.
Exactly. So if for us, it's a matter of cutting the damage now or waiting and let it be worse later. Those are in my view, are the only two options for us.
I agree 100%. And instead of talking about for us, I would say for the Ukrainians, more importantly, because the people who have really paid the blood price.
Absolutely agree.
And not only the blood price in terms of what's happened to their country territorially, economically, and so forth and so on. This war has been an unmitigated disaster. And for the people of Ukraine, I think this war has to be brought to a halt as quickly as possible before even more damage is done.
Yeah, because right now, and this, I'll end on this because I know we're past time here, but the future of Ukraine is being squandered by the day here. I mean, the war will end. I mean, there's no victory. I don't think anybody is under the delusion that a victory is possible anymore. But every day that you delay doing the things that you've laid out here throughout this program comes at the cost, pointless cost, of the very men who are going to be needed to rebuild this country. And you're sacrificing an entire generation of the population.
It's disastrous.